Hello and welcome. This session is about authentication context. An application can use authentication context to trigger the evaluation of Azure AD conditional access policy. This allows the policy to match the requirements for individual components of an app. For instance, a website could require MFA or terms of use to be agreed when a particular page is accessed. Authentication contexts are also used for protected actions, which is a new feature that has just gone into public preview. Keep watching and I'll show you how authentication contexts work for custom apps, SharePoint, and protected actions. Don't forget to subscribe and keep learning. Click the bell to keep up to date. Come with me into the cloud. Let's start by reminding ourselves how we actually authenticate to an application. So I have my application and we'll call this application A. We have our user and we also have the browser that we're using. And the user is going to go to the application using the application URL. And the user could have already been authenticated to the app, and in which case a cookie would be passed to prove that user's authentication. But in our case, we're going to say user is currently not authenticated. So what the app will do is redirect the user up to Azure AD. And we arrive at Azure AD and there's an authentication string that's sent up. And that string is basically saying, please authenticate the user to application A. So step 1, we hit the app. Step 2, we get redirected up to Azure. Now, Azure needs the user to be authenticated. So this will happen here. So this is step 3, and we're going to auth the user. And that authentication of the user will happen in whatever way is set up for that user. So cloud-only user, we will use a username and password in the cloud. It could be a hybrid user, in which case we're using a username from on-prem. Probably the password is synced to the cloud using password hash synchronization. And the user could be using an authenticator app, going passwordless, using a FIDO2 key, and so on. It really doesn't matter. Azure AD gets the user authenticated. Next job is, are we going to issue a token to prove the user's authentication to application A? And that's where conditional access evaluation can actually kick in. And the question is, are we going to allow the user to access application A? And of course, all the good things about conditional access kick in. What's the user's location? What's the device that's being used? Is the device compliant? Have the requirements for actually issuing a token been matched? If the answer to all that is yes, then the next thing that will happen is we'll return a token back to the application, and that could be an ID token in this particular case, as in proof of authentication of the user to the application. And that ID token will prove the user's authenticated to the app. At the same time as passing back the ID token, there will be a cookie that comes back, and that cookie will store in the browser, and that is proof of the user's authentication to Azure AD. So this solution allows evaluation of the user's access to the application. Let's just finish the numbering on here. So 1, we hit the app. 2, we're being redirected up to Azure, saying please authenticate the user to application A. 3, we authenticate the user to Azure. And 4, we're going to evaluate conditional access. And 5, we're going to pass the token back, and also the cookie, allowing access to application A. But of course, the reality is that an awful lot of applications are made up of multiple components. And if you've got a website, it could have multiple pages. If it's SharePoint, you could have multiple sites within SharePoint. And each of those pages or sites might require different authorization. So to access one page, you might absolutely need MFA, or you might need phishing resistant MFA. To access another page, you might need terms of use to be agreed. So this page, we go terms of use. This page, we want to have MFA. Now, of course, the application could sort of do its own terms of use and give back the terms of use, get the agreement from the user and so on. But wouldn't it be nice if we could bring that behavior for each of the individual components of the app into conditional access? And this is where the magic of authentication contexts kick in. An authentication context is a particular claim that the app can request from Azure AD. Before the claim is issued, CA policy can be evaluated. Are we going to issue this claim? And the CA policy could require MFA. CA policy could require terms of use to be agreed. And that's all done before the claim is issued. There are actually 25 authentication context claims that can be used. And the claim name is ACRS, as in Authentication Context References. And the claim values are C1 to C25. So let's go back to the previous. We could have already authenticated the app and then we hit a particular page. And what happens now, and this is step 2, we're going to be redirected back up to Azure and we'll send back the authentication string. We will add on to this. We'll say ACRS equals whatever number we want. So let's say it's C2. That's number 2. Please authenticate this user to this application and give back an ACRS claim with a value of C2. So once again, Azure AD is going to check the user's authenticated. Well, this time what can happen is the cookie can be passed. So it's seamless single sign-on. The cookie just gets passed through. We're already signed in. CA evaluation. We always do CA evaluation. So is the user allowed to access the application? And then what we do is we do, are we going to issue the claim? Issue ACRS equals C2 question mark. That is the question. And the answer to that is yes. If that's good, then what will happen is the ID token will be issued, and inside that ID token, we have the ACRS equals C2 claim set inside the ID token. And that's it really. So the app is asking for a particular claim type. That particular claim type will only be issued if the appropriate conditional access policy is satisfied. Now, if there is no conditional access policy, it's always satisfied. So if there's no conditional access policy saying how C2 is to be issued or under what conditions C2 is to be issued, then what will happen is the app will automatically get back the C2 claim. Now, Microsoft have extended the use of authentication context to protected actions. And we'll get into a demo of using authentication context for application access. And then I will explain what protected actions are and how to set them up. So let's get into that demo. Okay, I'm going to use my test app, XTS OIDC v2. And I'm going to request an ID token, and I'm going to use CodeFlow to do that. So we're going to sign in as my user John, and we've got a code back. I'm going to convert the code to token, and if we have a look at this, notice there is no ACRS claim in here at all. It's an ID token. It's an ID token for my application, and there's my client ID for the application, and we're signed in as John Williams. Okay, let's go back to the home page, and let's, this time when we sign in, ask for a C1 authentication context claim value. So I'm going to click on the link here, and it's going to send me off again. This time we've gone up to Azure AD, we've got the authentication string, and we're requesting this particular claim type. I haven't had to sign in this time because it's automatically using the cookie that is held in the browser. So I'm going to convert the code to token, and I have an ACRS claim. Let's look in Fiddler. And what we can see in Fiddler is we've got an initial log on to Azure. So let's have let's choose the right one, this one here. And I'm going to copy that. And I'm just going to go to the text wizard and URL decode it. Okay, so copy that and drop that in to Notepad. And we're going to go now and look at the second interaction that we had with Azure, which is this one. And this is where we asked for the C1 claim value. So once again, select it into the text wizard, URL decode it, and drop it into Notepad. And I'm not going to go into the details of these authentication strings. What I want to do is point out the difference. And in the second one, we are actually asking for a claim to be added to the ID token. The claim type is ACRS, which is shown there, and the value is C1. So that's how we ask for this particular claim to be added to the ID token. So let's now go to the Entra portal and have a look at the authentication context defined. So I'm going to go under Protect and Secure, Conditional Access. And the first thing is, if we look at authentication context, and what have I got? I've got C1 and I've got C2. Now, normally you would have some sensible name, but what I've done is I've actually chosen here to use the name as the same as the ID that is requested. So when my app asks for a C1 value, I've got the same name. I like to minimize the levels of interaction in my test environment. Normally, you'd have this as a sensible name, such as, if the policy that deals with the issuing of a C1 claim is going to do MFA, you would call it MFA. If it was going to deal with terms of use, you would call it terms of use. So let's just create a new one. And I'm going to give it a example name. All right, and it's C3 in this case. Of course, I've got my C1 to 25 that I can select. Well, I've already used C1 and C2, so it starts at C3, and I'm going to save that. Okay, now if we go to the policies, we can see that I've got a policy defined here. So when C2 is requested, what I want to do a terms of use for James Bond and John Williams. When? Always. Okay, so if we look at the details, we got specified users, we got James Bond and John Williams, and we look at the C2 in here. Notice my example name has appeared as well. And what's the grant? The grant is terms of use. Okay, let's just enable this, save that, and let's just have a look at terms of use if you're not familiar with it. Now, the simplest way of looking at this actually is to look at new terms. And I give it a name for this terms of use. I upload a PDF file that actually contains the terms of use. And then I've got things like require user to expand the terms of use. So require user to look inside the PDF, require user to consent on every device, and so on. So I can define, not only the terms of use document, but also the interaction of the user with the terms of use. Okay, let's go back again to my conditional access. and look at the policies, and I've got another one in here which is a C1 policy, which again is for the same users, and the authentication context here is C1. What do I want to happen? I want to actually require multi-factor. So I'm going to turn that on as well. So I've turned on 2 policies. So let's go and actually have a look at that from the user experience. Now, if we go back to my application, remember I have a C1 claim. I got it because there was no policy in place. Let's go back and request that again. So I've gone home and I'm going to do code flow C1 authentication context. And this time it's immediately prompting me for MFA. So I'm going to approve that sign-in and convert the code to token. And of course, I have a C1, but this time my ability to get a C1 was gated by the fact that I had to do MFA. Let's close that off and let's go to SharePoint. And I'm going to go to SharePoint and I'm going to sign in as my user John. And I've got access to the SharePoint site. Now, what I want to do is go to a different site. I want to go to the legal case law site. Click on that. And I'm being asked to agree the terms of use. So I can look at my terms of use and then I can accept. And now I'm in the legal case law site. So that's an example of the authentication context used with a custom app, but also used with SharePoint. Let's look a little bit more at SharePoint. And I'm going to go back to, I've actually got the portal in here for SharePoint. And we'll go across and we'll go to my active sites. And we'll look at the legal case law site and look at settings. And what you can see is a sensitivity label that is using the C2 authentication context. How do we get that sensitivity label? We have to use Purview. Now, I said earlier that protected actions use authentication context. And protected actions have just gone into public preview. Protected actions require a CA policy to be evaluated before a particular administrative role permission can be used. For instance, you might be a conditional access administrator, and if the permission required to create a new CA policy is designated as a protected action, you'll be required to satisfy a CA policy before you can create a new policy. Okay, let's have a look at that. So I'm going to go back to my Entra portal, and this time I'm going to choose roles and admins. If I look at my roles and admins, I've got this new protected actions tab here. But first of all, let's have a look at there's a conditional access administrator. And John is a conditional access administrator, and therefore he will be able to create policies, he will be able to edit policies, and so on. But I can add a protected action. And so I go add protected actions, and I'm going to select a permission that I want to protect, and I'm going to choose access policy create. So this is our conditional access policy create. I'm going to protect that. And how am I going to gate it? Well, I gate it using an authentication context. So I'm going to gate it using the C1 authentication context, saying that you must do MFA before you can do this. Now, of course, if this was a production environment, of course, I'd have already done MFA before I'm allowed to do anything in terms of administration. But what I could have is a conditional access policy that says you have to do phishing resistant MFA before you can actually do this action. But for now, I'm just going to leave that as C1. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to go back to my other environment, and I'm going to close that off. I've had a few problems using the Entra portal, so I'm going to use the Azure portal. I'm going to sign in as my user John. And John, for this demo, has actually been enabled as a conditional access administrator. So we'll go to conditional access. So we're looking down here for security, and we're going to go in here and look at our policies. And I can go in as John and I can modify and edit the policy without a problem. So I could add in someone in here, remove someone, etc. Okay, let's go back to the conditional access page and click on create a new policy. And this is the one that is protected. So here it says missing required claim. So I'm going to click yes on that. And it's prompting me for MFA. So I'm going to put in my MFA in here. And that should sign me in and allow me to create a new policy, which it does. Thanks for watching this session. Now you know how applications and protected actions can trigger a particular Azure AD conditional access policy using authentication context. Don't forget to subscribe and keep learning. And please click that bell to receive notifications as my new videos become available. I'll see you next time in the cloud. Thanks for watching my channel. Subscribe for more free training. You might like to join me for my Identity Masterclass. Hopefully, see you soon.